Dr. Elias Monroe stepped through the shimmering barrier of the Thalzar biodome, his boots landing softly on ground that pulsed faintly with alien energy. The air was thick and humid, alive with the buzz of unseen insects and the low hum of a hive mind at rest, but never silent. Before him stood Queen Varelia, towering and motionless, her chitinous body reflecting the soft violet light of the chamber. Her eyes, a constellation of glowing amber, studied him with the cold, unblinking attention of a predator considering a mouse. Elias felt his throat tighten. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he had come too far, and behind him, the entrance had already sealed. He took a breath. Humanity's diplomats had prepared documents, peace terms, cultural briefings, everything except what to do when your counterpart could kill you with a thought. Still, he wasn't here to make demands. That's what made this different. He didn't reach for a treaty or a translator device. Instead, slowly, he unzipped a pocket on the side of his worn satchel and pulled out something small, something delicate and absurd in its simplicity. It was a wooden music box, no larger than his palm, carved with careful hands decades ago by his grandmother. He had carried it through the vacuum of space, across ruined outposts, and past the ruins of diplomatic efforts gone wrong. Holding it carefully, he stepped forward and offered it to the queen, both hands outstretched, the gesture humble and uncertain. The Thalzar guards flinched, weapons twitching to life, but the queen raised a single clawed limb. Silence filled the chamber, so deep and thick it made Elias's ears ring. Varelia lowered her gaze to the object. Her limbs did not move. Her antennae stilled. The air itself felt as if it were holding its breath. She stared at the box, and something strange flickered in her gaze, something neither Elias nor any human had ever seen in Thalzar eyes: hesitation. Slowly, impossibly slowly, she reached out with two of her long, jointed fingers and touched the box, as if afraid it might vanish. Elias gently showed her how to twist the little handle, and with a faint click, the box began to play a quiet tune, soft, sweet, and deeply human. A lullaby from Earth, over 100 years old. The queen did not speak. She did not move. But Elias saw the faint tremble in her carapace, the way her breathing hitched. For all her psychic power and towering size, she seemed stunned. The melody echoed through the chamber, notes bouncing gently off the crystalline walls, wrapping the space in something fragile, almost holy. Varelia had seen countless worlds burn. She had absorbed the minds of leaders and generals. Her race conquered not with bombs, but with thoughts, bending lesser species to the hive's will. Yet now she stood paralyzed, not by a weapon or a threat, but by a box made of wood and sound. She gently cradled it, like something ancient and sacred. Around them, the guards began to shift uncomfortably. Thalzar ministers watched from behind the barrier walls, unsure if this was a trap or a miracle. But Elias said nothing. He had already spoken enough in all his missions. Words had done nothing before. This time, he had brought something smaller than a sentence, quieter than diplomacy. And it had stopped a queen. Minutes passed. The song ended, but the queen did not let go. Her claws curled around the box, and her great eyes narrowed, not in threat, but in thought. Elias didn't know it yet, but deep within her neural hive, something was shifting. For the first time in centuries, a foreign thought entered the network not from force, but from feeling. Varelia's psychic web rippled. Distant drones stumbled. A counselor dropped its staff and clutched its head. Somewhere across the hive world, a young larval mind dreamed of color for the first time. The queen blinked. "Why?" she said, her voice low and strange, like stone cracking under pressure. Elias swallowed. "Because it was all I had that truly mattered," he answered simply. She stared at him, the box still playing faint echoes of its final note. Around them, the air had changed. The diplomats watching from orbit would later argue about what had really happened here. Some would call it psychological warfare. Others would say it was luck. But none of them were in that room. None of them saw how something so small, a piece of wood, a song, a gesture, could unmake walls built from fear and history. Queen Varelia said nothing more that day. She turned and walked deeper into the hive, music box in hand, leaving her guards confused and silent. Elias remained standing, unsure whether he had just started peace or ended everything. But one thing was certain, the queen had stopped. And that was more than anyone had ever done. Queen Virelia did not return for 3 full cycles after she walked away with the music box clutched in her claws, and in her absence, the great halls of the Thalzar hive city trembled not from physical movement but from the strange, spreading unease in the minds of those linked to the queen's thoughts. It began as a quiet static in the psychic network, a tiny distortion like a distant radio picking up an old forgotten frequency. The royal counselors, ancient and heavily fused into the hive's core, reported sudden flashes of memory, not their own images of trees, laughter, small children, and the gentle rhythmic hum of the tune the queen had played over and over. The hive was not used to confusion. The Thalzar were a civilization built on control of thought, of instinct, of everything. They consumed and absorbed other species not out of cruelty, but to improve themselves, to make their collective stronger. They had never needed emotion. But now, something was leaking through the queen's mind, and it wasn't logic. Dr. Elias Monroe, meanwhile, remained confined within a tall crystalline spire near the edge of the hive's heart, under constant surveillance by guards who spoke no words and showed no expression. He had been given food, air, and silence. His only company was the low, living hum of the structure itself. No one told him what the queen had done with the music box. No one told him if she was pleased or furious. He had assumed the visit had gone well, at least he was still alive, but he also knew the Thalzar were unpredictable in ways humans hadn't yet learned to understand. On the second day of his confinement, a figure finally entered his chamber. It wasn't the queen. It was a minister shorter than Virelia, but still towering compared to Elias, its mandibles twitching in frustration. Through a cold, translated voice, it demanded to know the true function of the object. "What power does it hold?" the creature asked, staring at Elias with suspicion. "What kind of mental toxin was it laced with?" "It has caused interference." Elias blinked, genuinely confused. "It's a music box. It plays a song. That's all." The minister hissed in disbelief. "Her Majesty listens to it constantly. She will not speak to the council. She ignores the mind link. She isolates." For the Thalzar, that word carried weight. Queens did not isolate. They were the hive. Elias didn't know what to say. He hadn't given her poison. He had offered her a piece of home, something fragile and human. And it had somehow cut deeper than any speech or treaty. The minister left, leaving Elias with more questions than answers. Across the hive, strange things continued to happen. Several drone clusters failed to respond to orders on time. A group of young warriors in training paused mid-drill, staring into the distance as if trying to remember something. One drone began scratching symbols into the walls of its barracks, strange, curved shapes that resembled nothing from Thalzar language. When investigated, the marks were found to match human musical notation. The queen's silence became more dangerous than any order she could have given. Her thoughts had always guided the Thalzar like stars guide ships. But now, her focus was elsewhere. When she finally appeared again, it was sudden and quiet. Without warning, the great chamber doors parted, and she entered Elias's holding chamber, still carrying the wooden music box in both hands like it was a fragile piece of her soul. Her eyes burned not with rage, but something far more dangerous, curiosity. Elias stood, unsure if he should speak, but she broke the silence first. "Why? Did you give this to me?" she asked, her voice low and filled with something new uncertainty. "Because," Elias said carefully, "no one ever gave you anything before, did they?" She stared at him. "My kind take. We do not need." "Maybe," he said. "But maybe that's the problem." She said nothing, but her grip tightened slightly on the box. "It reminded me," she said after a long pause, "of something I do not remember. A sound. From before I was queen. A dream, perhaps. Or a lie." Elias felt a chill. Had she once been more than this? Had she once known music? You weren't always part of the hive? He asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and beckoned him to follow. Against the loud protests of her ministers and advisors, she took Elias deep into the central hive lattice, past flowing tunnels of light and memory, down into a chamber carved with forgotten glyphs and buried emotions. There, she showed him a mural faded, cracked, and ancient. It showed Thalzar not as monsters or machines, but as artists, sculptors, musicians. A lost age, erased from their shared memory but not from hers. The song had brought it back. Just a little. You reminded me, she said quietly, that there is more to what we were. Elias felt a strange weight in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or awe. Maybe. Both. But the queen's change did not go unnoticed for long. Her ministers, unable to sense her mind properly through the hive link, began fearing that something was wrong. Rumors spread that she had been compromised, that the human had planted a virus not in her body, but in her mind. They demanded her silence be ended, or her rule questioned. The hive stirred with unrest. Varelia, unaware or uncaring of the danger growing behind her, sat in the old chamber alone at night, playing the music box and sketching strange curved shapes onto the walls. Human letters. Human songs. Human feelings. She did not know it yet, but she was changing. Something deep inside was waking, like fire in a frozen cave. And all of it had started from a single gesture, one small thing that should have meant nothing, but now refused to be forgotten. The hive was restless, its once perfect harmony now filled with flickers of disorder that spread like cracks through ancient glass. Queen Varelia, once the unwavering pillar of the Thalzar sovereignty, no longer spoke through the hive mind, and her silence sent tremors through every corner of the great colony world. The ministers could no longer read her thoughts, and that alone was enough to make them fear her. For a species that had erased individuality generations ago, the queen's silence wasn't just confusing, it was dangerous. As the queen spent longer hours in the forgotten chamber of art and memory, surrounded by old glyphs and the soft hum of the music box, her thoughts turned further inward. She began sketching new designs on the walls, some in the shape of music, others that resembled human faces and starscapes she had never visited. She had begun to dream, something her kind should never have been able to do. And though she never said the word, she was starting to feel something unfamiliar every time she looked at the wooden box longing. Dr. Elias Monroe noticed the change in her posture, in the way her voice no longer echoed with cold authority, but with quiet reflection. One evening, as they sat in silence near the old mural, she asked him questions not about politics or weapons, but about Earth, its oceans, its sunsets, and the meaning behind lullabies. Why would humans sing to children when they sleep? She asked softly, her voice barely louder than the box's fading melody. Elias smiled sadly. Because the world is loud. And sometimes, a soft song tells a child they're safe, even when they're not. The queen stared at him for a long time after that. But while she explored these buried parts of herself, her hive began to splinter. The ministers, disturbed by her emotional shift and the unexplained weakening of the collective mind link, declared that the queen was compromised. They believed the human had infected her with a psychic toxin disguised as sound. Some demanded her removal, others whispered of exile. And a few, the oldest and most loyal, still hoped she would return to the cold logic of the past. But they were all afraid. Varelia, without giving them permission, had begun to think alone. And worse, some drones had started to feel echoes of her thoughts. In distant worker colonies, labor units began slowing their tasks to look up at the stars. Soldiers paused drills to hum sounds they did not understand. One even fashioned a crude instrument using spare parts and played a jagged, broken tune that was still unmistakably musical. These were small events, isolated and quiet, but in the hive mind, they rang louder than any rebellion. The queen was changing, and she was taking others with her. When the ministers confronted her in the royal assembly chamber, their voices laced with panic and rage, they demanded that she destroy the music box and submit to a neural cleansing. They claimed she had fallen victim to an alien trap. But Varelia did not raise her voice or strike them down. Instead, she spoke with quiet force. The human gave me a gift. Not power. Not lies. Just a sound. A feeling. And I listened. Her calmness shook them more than any roar would have. You are not meant to feel, one of the elders hissed. You are our mind, not our heart. Then perhaps that is what we've forgotten, she replied, holding the music box gently between her claws. That we once were more. The ministers left in fury, and within a day they called for a full council. But something else was already in motion. Late that night, a shadow slipped through the lower tunnels of the hive, into the chamber where Elias slept under light guard. The door slid open without warning, and in rushed two heavily armored drones not sent by the queen, but by the ministers. Elias was seized, dragged from his bed, and taken to a cold room deep. Beneath the hive lattice, where machines hummed with ancient code and sharp instruments gleamed in quiet threat. He understood at once. They weren't going to kill him. They were going to take his mind, extract it, scan it, and erase what they believed had infected their queen. He struggled, shouted, demanded to speak with Varelia, but the guards said nothing, only shackled him to a metal table as one of the psychic extractors began to warm up. It was almost too late when the doors burst open. The queen arrived, flanked not by soldiers, but by unarmed drones artists, builders, and a few who had started drawing music into their walls. Without a word, she extended a hand and the entire room pulsed with raw mental energy. The extractor cracked in half. The guards dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, not in obedience, but in awe. This human is under my protection, she said, her voice echoing louder than it ever had before. And I will no longer serve fear. That moment spread through the hive like fire through dry leaves. Some followed her instantly, throwing down their weapons and joining her. Others resisted, retreating into bunkers and broadcast towers, calling for a return to the old ways. But the queen was no longer hiding her change. She made it public. She walked the hive, not with armor or threats, but with presence. She placed the music box in the central atrium for all to hear. She sang softly, brokenly, but she sang. A queen singing. It had never happened before. And across the hive, minds woke up. Not many, not at once, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to crack what had once been unbreakable. The human had not given them a virus. He had given them a mirror. And now they could no longer unsee what they had lost. For 3 days and nights, the hive was restless in a way it had never been before. Beneath the thick layers of order and obedience, something old and dangerous had begun to stir doubt. And it all traced back to one thing, a small wooden box that played a quiet human song. Queen Varelia no longer allowed the voices of her ministers to guide her. She stopped responding to the hive link and instead chose silence, listening to the music over and over again in the ancient chamber buried deep beneath the hive's core. The ministers tried to re-establish control, calling emergency gatherings, broadcasting strict commands across the network, but their voices no longer reached the queen. It was as if she had stepped outside the network, and by doing so, she had torn a hole in it. That hole began to leak. Some drones, particularly the youngest, began to show signs of individual thought. A few hesitated when given orders. Some looked around as if suddenly aware of their surroundings in ways they never had been. One worker drone was found humming, not speaking, not communicating, but humming a faint pattern that resembled the lullaby from the music box. The ministers were terrified. To them, this wasn't change, it was contamination. Dr. Elias Monroe remained under guard, but he could feel the tension growing. Guards who once stared at him without expression now looked at him with something like confusion or curiosity. One even asked him what warm rain felt like, though it quickly went silent after asking, as if afraid of being heard. Elias knew something important was happening, something bigger than him, bigger than the mission. What he didn't know was that his simple gift had begun to shake the foundation of the entire hive. Queen Varelia called for him again. This time, when he entered the chamber, he found her surrounded by strange items she had ordered her drones to make. Carvings, patterns, some beautiful, some strange. And in the center, always, was the music box. She held it gently in her claws. "They want to take it from me," she said without turning around. "They believe it has changed me." Elias nodded. "Has it?" he asked quietly. She turned, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. Then she said, "I do not know what I was before I heard this song. Only that I feel more now than I ever did then. I feel incomplete. And I want to know why." Elias stepped closer. "That's what it means to be human. We don't understand everything we feel. But we keep going. We keep asking." The queen sat in silence, processing his words in her vast, complex mind. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "They will not allow this to continue. They will act soon." Elias understood. The ministers were afraid of losing control. They would try to remove her, maybe even erase her mind. And if they did, everything that had begun to change would vanish. "You have to show them what this means," Elias said. "Let them see that you're not broken, that you've just remembered something they forgot." The queen's eyes narrowed in thought. "If I show weakness, they will strike. But if I show them truth, perhaps they will pause." She stood, taller and more commanding than Elias had ever seen her, yet gentler too, like a storm that had learned to hold back. That same day, she summoned the ministers to the central court. It was the largest space in the hive, a place used only for the most serious decisions. It had not been used in over a century. When the ministers arrived, they found the queen not seated on her high throne, but standing among the common drones, the music box in her hand. Without a word, she played it. The soft, simple tune filled the vast chamber. No one moved. No one spoke. And then the queen did something no Thalzar ruler had ever done. She spoke not through the hive mind, but with her voice. "This is not a weapon," she said. "This is memory. This is what we once were, what we can be again." The ministers hissed and whispered among themselves. One stepped forward, braver or more foolish than the rest. "You are compromised, my queen. This sound has damaged your mind. It spreads among the young. It threatens our unity. It threatens your control," she replied calmly. "But perhaps unity is not obedience. Perhaps it is understanding." Another minister shouted, "You speak like a human." The queen turned to Elias, who stood quietly nearby. "No," she said. "I speak like myself." For the first time in 1,000 years, a silence followed. And then, without warning, a low hum began to rise, not from the box, but from the chamber. Dozens of drones, maybe more, had begun humming along with the melody. It was not perfect. It was not rehearsed. But it was real. The ministers were stunned. One by one, the sound grew louder as more joined in. Some sang. Some wept without knowing why. The hive had cracked. But it had not fallen. It had begun to wake up. The queen stood in the center of it all, tall and still, as the song she had been given something small, something human spread through a species that had forgotten what it meant to feel. The echoes of the humming lingered long after the music box had gone silent. In the heart of the great Thalzar court, the sound of untrained voices, drones, workers, even a few warriors rose like a gentle storm, uncontrolled yet powerful. Queen Varelia stood at the center, silent and calm, watching the ministers slowly realize something they had feared for generations. The hive was no longer fully theirs. For the first time, others had chosen to follow a feeling instead of a command. The council's reaction was swift. While some ministers stood frozen in disbelief, others turned toward old instincts: control, order, domination. One of the elders stepped forward, his voice shaking not from fear, but rage. "You have broken the unity," he growled, raising a hand toward the queen. "You are no longer fit to rule." His words hit like thunder, and a tremor ran through the chamber. But the queen did not flinch. Her claws gently closed the lid of the music box. "Then prove it," she said. "Challenge me." A challenge to the throne, an ancient right, forgotten by most, but still carved into the oldest stone laws of the hive. The court gasped. The ministers whispered, and the queen's words echoed like a blade drawn from its sheath. The elder accepted without hesitation. His name was Vexiron, the oldest and most rigid of the council, a creature of sharp lines and colder thoughts. Within an hour, the court floor was cleared, the watchers gathered, and the challenge began. Varelia stepped forward without armor, without weapons, save the music box placed behind her like a relic. Vexiron towered over her, armored and crackling with neural spikes, his mind sharpened to strike. The duel was not of claws or blood, but of thought, an ancient psychic battle where minds collided in open space. The queen entered the arena calmly, and when their thoughts connected, the force of it was like thunder. The court felt it ripple around them. Vexiron struck first, hurling images of war and conquest, trying to remind the queen of her duty, her past, her original purpose. He showed her the strength of the hive, the long line of rulers who had crushed rebellion and erased emotion. But Varelia did not respond with fire. She responded with sound. In the shared space between their minds, she let the lullaby play, not just the music, but the memory behind it, the earth child who had once held the box, the mother's soft voice, the sky outside the window. She let the feeling flood the link. Vexiron screamed, not from pain, but from confusion. "This is weakness," he roared in their shared space. "This is chaos." "No," she answered gently. "This is peace." For a moment, the court felt the truth in her thoughts. The song did not command. It did not control. It offered a choice. Vexiron faltered. His mind wavered, his walls cracking. And in that moment of stillness, the queen's will surged, not as a weapon, but as a wave of feeling. She did not crush him. She embraced him with her mind. She showed him a future where the hive did not consume every species it met. A future where they remembered beauty, not just strength. Vexiron collapsed to the court floor, gasping, stunned. He was not defeated in the old way, but he had lost. And the court knew it. The queen had won. But victory did not come without a cost. As the queen helped Vexiron rise, a distant alarm echoed through the hive. A second group of ministers, those who had not attended the court, had launched a rebellion. They called themselves the Preservers. Armed with control rods and neural dampeners, they stormed the outer chambers, cutting the hive mind in pieces to stop the spread of emotion. Their goal was simple: remove the queen, destroy the human, and erase the music. Fire spread real and psychic as systems clashed, drones panicked, and centuries of order cracked like old stone under pressure. Elias, hidden in the queen's inner chamber, could hear the distant rumble of the chaos rising. He knew they were coming for him. Before he could plan a way out, two drones burst into the room, but instead of attacking, they shielded him. These were drones who had heard the song, who had felt. They led him through tunnels once forbidden. Above them, the hive was tearing itself in two. Queen Varelia faced her ministers in the flame-lit court. "You cannot hold back thought," she said. "Not forever." One of the rebels, younger but just as sharp, hissed, "Then we'll destroy the thoughts before they spread." They surged at her, but they did not expect resistance from her side. Drones who had never lifted a claw in battle now stood to protect her, not because they were ordered, but because they believed. The clash was brief but violent, light against shadow, old command against new purpose. In the end, the queen stood wounded, but stronger than ever. She ordered no execution. She showed no cruelty. Instead, she offered every rebel the same thing the human had offered her: a choice. Most fled. A few stayed. One dropped his weapon and wept. The fire in the court was not just destruction. It was cleansing. Something ancient had burned away and something new had begun to grow in its place. The fires took a full day to die. Smoke rose from broken tunnels and scorched control chambers, but no further blood was spilled. The civil war within the hive had ended not because one side was completely destroyed, but because the will to destroy had finally collapsed. In the hours that followed, silence spread, not the obedient silence of the past, but a quiet filled with breath, thought, and something new: reflection. Queen Varelia stood at the highest point of the hive, gazing down at her world cracked, damaged, but still alive. She no longer wore the neural crown that once connected her to every mind. She had set it aside by choice. Instead, she watched as the first group of drones, still nervous, still unsure, gathered beneath her without being called. They had come to see what the future looked like now. Among them were builders, guards, thinkers, and even two of the youngest ministers who had stepped away from the rebel ranks in the final hours of the fire. Their expressions were not full of praise, nor blind loyalty. They were filled with questions. And to the queen, that was enough. She turned as Elias Monroe approached, his clothing still marked with soot and dust, his face tired but smiling. "You survived," she said quietly. He nodded. "Barely. Your people are determined." "They were," she replied, pausing. "Now they are becoming something else." Together they looked at the crowd below. "They don't know what to do next," Elias said. "Neither do I," Virelia answered. "But perhaps we don't have to know. Perhaps we just need to try." The music box sat on the stone ledge beside her, untouched since the fire began. Its surface was scorched, and the once smooth edges were now rough with ash. But when she opened the lid, the melody still played soft and cracked, but still there. And as the first notes drifted into the air, the gathered Thalzar looked up, not in fear, not under command, but because they wanted to listen. One drone began to hum again, shyly. Another joined. The sound spread like it had before, but this time with less fear and more warmth. The queen let it continue, watching as the once silent hive began to sing, not perfectly, not beautifully, but honestly. Later that day, the queen made her first declaration as ruler of the awakened Thalzar, a name chosen not by her, but suggested by a young drone who had painted spirals on his walls after the psychic battle. Her words were broadcast through voice, not the hive mind, and many still found it strange, uncomfortable even. But they listened. She spoke of the battle not as a victory, but as a moment of change. She did not demand loyalty. She invited understanding. And then, to the surprise of all, including Elias, she announced that the hive would no longer expand by force. "We have taken much," she said. "But now we will learn what it means to give. And to grow without conquest." The old ministers who had survived the purge stood in silence, unsure whether to argue or obey. But before they could decide, a surprising thing happened. A worker drone stepped forward and placed a small gift at the queen's feet, an awkward sculpture shaped like a star, with one carved line down the center. Then another drone stepped forward, holding a painted stone. Then another, and another. The queen said nothing, but her chest tightened with something she still didn't fully understand. And somewhere in the crowd, a small voice whispered, "We're dreaming now." That night, the queen returned to her private chamber, where Elias waited with something wrapped in cloth. She looked at him curiously as he unwrapped it. "It's a solar-powered speaker," he said, a little embarrassed. "Old Earth tech. Plays thousands of songs. I thought maybe you'd want to hear more." The queen lifted the device and turned it on. The room filled with music, richer and deeper than the music box had ever produced. Some songs were joyful, others sad. A few were wordless, just emotion and sound. The queen listened, tears glimmering at the edge of her vision. "So many voices," she whispered. "Each one different. And still part of the same story," Elias said. The queen looked at him. "Maybe we can be part of that story too." In the months that followed, change spread slowly but steadily across the hive. Drones were given time each day to create. Some painted, others sang, and a few even began to write strange poetry that made no sense but brought laughter anyway. The queen sent envoys to nearby systems, not with warships, but with messages. Some were ignored. Some were feared. But one, a distant colony of peaceful traders, sent a reply. The message was only 3 words: "We hear you." That reply was carved into the wall of the queen's new chamber, above the music box, which still worked. The war scars faded slowly. Not all accepted the change. Some left. Others resisted in silence. But the hive was no longer a single mind. It had become many, woven together by memory, song, and choice. One evening, Elias and Varelia stood outside the great chamber where young drones now studied art and languages. The queen turned to him and asked, "What do humans call a gift that changes everything?" Elias thought for a moment, then smiled. "We call it hope." She repeated the word softly, letting it settle in her mouth like a new melody. And as the stars shone above the hive, and the gentle hum of music drifted through the chambers below, the queen of the Thalzar finally understood. A single small gift offered without power or demand had done something no invasion ever could. It had cracked open a mind. It had changed a world. And in its place, something entirely new had begun to grow. A new song. A new future. A new way to exist, not above others, but alongside them.